Okay. Yesterday, the beginning of our discussion, we were talking about organic chemistry, but we said really, before we think about organic chemistry, we have to think about bonds. And remember what we said yesterday, most of the bonds that we'll be discussing in class are covalent bonds, either polar bonds where we have two atoms that don't share the electrons equally, or nonpolar bonds where they share the electrons equally. And when we have a lot of polar bonds in an area, that area will be hydrophilic. It will mix with water or dissolve in water if it's the right size. If we have a lot of nonpolar bonds in a section of a molecule, that section will be hydrophobic. It won't mix with water very well. It won't dissolve in water. Now, we mentioned that organic compounds contain the element carbon. But if you remember, when we first started talking about chemistry, there are 118 elements. Now, it's true that about 24 of those have only been made in a laboratory setting. But even if we consider the other 94 elements that are found in nature, there's 94 elements out there in nature. Organic chemistry is the chemistry of carbon. The other 93 elements are all part of what we call inorganic chemistry. Inorganic, in at the beginning of a word means not. So what's so special about carbon? Why is it the focus of its own branch of chemistry? We don't really put iron and study iron chemistry all by itself, or zinc chemistry or something like that. So what makes carbon so unique? And keep in mind that if we look at compounds that contain carbon, there are about as many compounds that contain carbon, so organic compounds. There are as many organic compounds as there are inorganic compounds of all the other elements put together. So it's not like we separate carbon off and then it's a very small field of study. There's a lot of carbon chemistry. So let's think about what carbon does that's crucial. And really the key is carbon's versatility in making chemical bonds. Compared to other elements, there's a lot more variety in the types of chemical bonds that carbon can make. So let's look at some of these crucial factors. One thing that's important is that carbon can make 4 chemical bonds. Most of the other elements normally make 1 or 2 or 3 chemical bonds, so they don't make as many as carbon. And just the simple fact that carbon can make more bonds means it can make more types of compounds. They can have more complicated arrangements. Now, the other day we said when we look at chemical bonds, we can have single bonds where we just have 2 electrons involved. We can have double bonds where we have 4 electrons involved, or we can have triple bonds. And carbon can make single bonds, it can make double bonds, it can make triple bonds. And in the same molecule, we can find all these sorts of bonds at different locations on different carbon atoms. Now, we talked at the beginning of class and then quite a bit yesterday, but carbon can make polar covalent bonds and nonpolar covalent bonds. Carbon can also make ionic bonds, but they're not as important in living organisms. When we look at carbon atoms are almost always in the center of a molecule, an organic molecule. In fact, we talk about kind of ignoring all the other elements and just looking at the carbon skeleton. And when we look at the carbon skeleton, so that's what we're going to focus on now. So we're going to ignore, in these examples, we just have hydrogen attached to the carbon. We can have carbon form what are called straight chains. And in a straight chains, the first carbon is connected to the second carbon is bonded to the third carbon atom is bonded to the fourth, and so on until we get to the end of all our carbon atoms. Now remember, carbon has to have 4 bonds. So the lines here represent bonds. The atoms are represented by their chemical symbols. So every C is 1 atom of carbon. Every H is 1 atom of hydrogen. So if you remember, hydrogen atoms need 1 line. So there's a line between this hydrogen atom on the very left of this molecule and the carbon atom to its right. So that line, that's a bond for that hydrogen. Now, since hydrogen atoms only make 1 bond, notice that this hydrogen and all the other hydrogens in this molecule only have 1 line by them. Carbon makes 4 bonds. So if we look at this first carbon on the left, there's a bond to the hydrogen that's written up above it, a bond to the hydrogen on its left, a bond to the hydrogen down below, and a bond to the next carbon in the chain. So if we look, this carbon has 4 lines around it, 4 bonds. And if we go through the molecule and we double check, all the hydrogen atoms should just have 1 bond connecting them to another atom. All the carbon atoms should have 4 bonds connecting them to other atoms. Now, keep in mind the analogy I used yesterday, because in some ways it's useful to think of bonds, as I said, like holding hands. And if you think about holding hands, this tells us 2 crucial things about how we have to draw these bonds. A bond always connects 2 atoms. You can't have a bond that just goes out into space. And you also can't have a bond that you draw in kind of a loop and it comes back to the same atom. As I say, think of this like holding hands. You might walk down the street holding hands with your imaginary invisible friend, and you may be perfectly happy, but the rest of us are not going to think you're holding hands with anybody. You might walk down the street and hold hands with yourself and be perfectly happy, but you're not holding hands with somebody else. So a bond has to connect 2 different atoms. The atom can't hold hands with itself, can't just hold hands with nothing. So we want to keep that in mind when we draw a bond. Now, beside a straight chain, we can have a branch chain. In a branch chain, again, if we ignore all the hydrogens and we start with our first carbon here on the left, we go to our second carbon and our third and then our fourth and then our fifth, notice there's a branch that comes down below this. We have a carbon, or we could have more than 1 carbon depending on the compound, that's off to the side. This would be a branch chain. And we can also have something that's called a ring or a cyclic compound. So let's think about starting with this carbon up on the top, and that carbon atom is bonded to the next carbon atom, which is bonded to the 3rd carbon atom, which is bonded to the 4th carbon atom, which is bonded to the 5th carbon atom. And then when we get to the last carbon atom in a ring, it's bonded back to the 1st carbon atom. So in a ring, we have essentially a circle of carbon atoms. So notice that when we draw rings especially, but even sometimes when our molecules are a little more linear, notice that each carbon atom has 2 hydrogens attached. So we could have drawn 2 lines coming out of this carbon with hydrogens attached, but sometimes you'll just see a carbon written as CH2, or the carbon on this end up above might be written as CH3. So all the examples that we'll look at won't show the bonds. When we draw our own molecules, we're going to try to always show all the bonds. Just because until we get used to drawing molecules, it's good to show our work so that we don't forget some of the rules. So we have 3 basic shapes. Now notice a lot of organic molecules are really large. When we look at some organic molecules, they have a chain connected to a ring of carbon. So an organic molecule doesn't have to be all one or the other of these shapes. It can be a mixture. So we want to keep that in mind. So the different shapes is another reason that carbon is kind of the central atom in organic chemistry. Now, notice that when we say that carbon atoms can make a straight chain, this is a little bit of an exaggeration. If we would look at the measurement of the angle, if we would look at this line between the first carbon atom and the second carbon atom, and the line between the second carbon atom and the third carbon atom, and we would measure that angle, we would get, I think it's called a protractor that we used in geometry to measure angles. But if we would get a protractor, this angle would be 180 degrees. However, when we look at carbon, that's not what we see, even in a straight chain. When we look at carbon atoms, and again, let's kind of ignore our hydrogens for the moment. Carbon atoms tend to go up and down in a zigzag pattern. So even a straight chain isn't really perfectly straight. When we look down the length of the molecule, it's pretty straight, but you know, there is some back and forth of the carbons there, so it's not completely straight. So we do want to keep that in mind. Now, even though a lot of times this is the easiest way to draw a molecule, we want to keep in mind that when we draw it, you know, if we're thinking about two of the hydrogens in here, and we look at our molecule, notice that two hydrogens that are attached to a carbon aren't really directly across from each other. They're at an angle. And this is important because one of the things that we'll begin talking about shortly, and by the end of the semester, you'll be tired of hearing about, I'm sure, is that when we look at a molecular level, even though they're really small, molecules have a very specific three-dimensional shape, and they work according to their three-dimensional shape. So if we look at this carbon on the left end with the three hydrogens attached, this is really a much more accurate representation there than if we go back here and we look at this carbon atom on the left, where it looks like all the hydrogen atoms are at right angles with each other. That's not really true in real life. So this is fine in terms of drawing a molecule and representing it, but we want to keep in mind that this really is distorting the shape a little bit. We really have this kind of zigzag pattern of the carbons. We don't have all the carbons in a straight line. So we want to keep in mind that that's the case. Now, when we actually draw a molecule, we can draw a molecule in several different ways. Those first drawings I showed you are actually examples of something called a Kekule structure. Kekule was a chemist. When we look at this, the nice thing about this is it shows us which atoms are bonded to which other atoms. So it shows us how the atoms are connected to each other in the molecule. But we can also draw a bond line structure. Now, think about the fact that I've told you that when we're looking at chemicals, if they have a charge of +1, we just write plus, we don't write the 1. And if we have one molecule of glucose, if we have one C6H12O6, we don't write one C6H12O6. We just write C6H12O6. So a lot of times a 1 is understood. So keep that in mind. We're trying to be as lazy as we can, in a sense, when we do chemistry. So another way to draw this molecule, which is actually called N-pentane, or just pentane sometimes, is as a bond line structure. Now, a bond line structure just shows the bonds between carbon atoms. So that means at this end of the line, there's a carbon atom. There's another carbon atom up here. So in this position, there's another carbon atom down here where the two lines meet. That would be this carbon. There's another atom up here. That would be this one. And finally, there's another carbon atom down here. That would be this one. Now in a bond line structure, the only bonds that we show are the bonds between carbon atoms and other carbon atoms. Or if we have something else in here, if we had some oxygen or some nitrogen or some sulfur, we would show the bonds that those atoms have. Notice in a bond line structure, we typically don't show any of the hydrogens. So if we think about, the very left end of this line, this is this carbon on the far left here. So to figure out how many hydrogens it has attached, we have to remember that carbon atoms always need 4 bonds. So if we're only showing this bond to the next carbon atom, we have to have 3 hydrogen atoms attached. And so a lot of times when we draw large molecules, because a lot of the molecules that are found in living organisms are very large, hundreds, thousands of atoms, we don't want to draw the hydrogens because they kind of get in the way and obscure the skeleton, the basic shape. So a lot of times we'll see some bond line structures. Now we can also use what's called a ball and spoke model, or it's sometimes called a ball and stick model. And basically this ball and stick model is based on Tinker Toys. We have balls of different colors and different sizes that represent the different atoms. Carbon atoms are usually represented, this looks like a dark gray here, but usually in the Tinker Toy sets that you could buy, they're represented as black. Think about what happens when you burn something. The main thing that's left is carbon atoms, black. Hydrogen atoms are typically shown as smaller than carbon atoms, and they're kind of a whitish color. So the spokes are the sticks, are the bonds. Now it's hard to see the spokes connecting the hydrogen to the carbon. If we go over here to the far right side of the molecule, we can see one, but there's really a spoke connecting each of these hydrogen balls to the carbon balls, or hydrogen atoms to carbon atoms. And finally, another way we can show a molecule is through a space filling model. And in a space filling model, instead of showing the bonds, because really when we have covalent bonds, remember we said that those were atoms sharing electrons. So the atoms are really butting right up next to each other. So again, the hydrogen atom is the lighter colored, but notice in a space filling model, it kind of shows the hydrogen atom embedded in the carbon atom. And this can be good because when we talk later about how proteins work, there are a lot of proteins that have kind of a hole in the model, or a ridge, or a groove in the molecule. And something is supposed to fit into that groove or that hole. And sometimes those grooves or holes are a lot easier to see with the space filling model than with any of the other models. So we have a lot of different ways that we can represent molecules. Most of the time in this class, we'll be using Kukuli structures, but every once in a while, we'll look at one of the others when it's kind of advantageous in terms of what we're trying to talk about. So this is another reason. Notice that this came about as a result of our discussion of the different types of shapes, the straight chains, the branch chains, the rings. So these are just some different ways that we could show, in this case, a straight chain, but we could do the same thing with a branch chain or a ring. So what are some other important reasons why carbon is important? Well, carbon can form some things called isomers. And whenever you see iso means the same. Back in geometry, there was something called isosceles triangles that had 2 angles that were the same and 2 sides that were the same. So isomers are molecules that have the same molecular formula. They have the same number of carbon atoms, the same number of hydrogen atoms, same number of oxygen atoms, same number of nitrogen atoms, whatever the atoms are that are in it. But there's a difference. The atoms are bonded together differently. So let's look at two isomers that are relatively small. Let's look at something called isobutane and butane. And this should be an A, isobutane and butane. So let's look at these. So here's butane down here, the lower one. So butane is a straight chain. We have a carbon with 3 hydrogens. That's bonded to the next carbon, which has 2 hydrogens. That's bonded to the next carbon, which has 2 hydrogens. And that's bonded to the last carbon that has 3 hydrogens. Notice there are 4 carbon atoms here. Isobutane has a carbon with 3 hydrogens bonded to a carbon with 1 hydrogen. And then that carbon's bonded to another carbon with 3 hydrogens. And then there's a branch or a side chain. That's another carbon with 3 hydrogens. Now notice if we look at these two isomers, let's count how many carbon atoms there are in isobutane, the top molecule. So we've got 1 carbon up here. Here's 2, 3, 4. Now let's count our hydrogens. We've got 3 hydrogens here. We've got 6, 7, 10. Now let's count butane. We've got 1 carbon here, 2, 3, 4. Remember up here we had 1, 2, 3, 4. So they both got the same number of carbons. We've got 3 hydrogens, 5 hydrogens, 7 hydrogens, 10. So we've got 10 hydrogens down here. We had 3, 6, 7, 10. We have 10 up there. So both of these have the formula C4H10. But the atoms are bonded together differently. So these are examples of isomers. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, it might not seem like any big deal, but for living things, keep in mind isomers have different properties. Sometimes one isomer is something that you can eat, and another isomer is something that's actually poisonous. And finally, there's kind of a variation of an isomer. Carbon can make something called a chiral molecule. Or I should say molecules, because they always occur in pairs. Chiral molecules are mirror images of each other. A lot of times, chiral molecules are called right and left-handed molecules. Think about your right and left hand. If you put your right and left hand together so that the fingers and the thumb line up, your right and left hand are not exactly identical, because if all your fingers line up, the palms are facing in the opposite direction. Now you can put your hand so that the palms are facing the same direction, but if you do that, your thumbs are on the opposite end. Your fingers are in a different order. So when we have things that are mirror images of each other, they're not exactly the same. And you have to have something that can make at least 4 bonds to have a chiral molecule. Because if we have a carbon atom, so we have a ball with a C here in the center, that's our carbon atom, and then we have 4 different bonds around it, and we're just representing these bonds by 4 different letters, W, X, Y, Z. And these 4 letters, these 4 bonds and this overall molecule are mirror images. So notice we have X on the top, closest to our mirror in the middle. Then we have W on the top, furthest away from the mirror. We have Z on the bottom, furthest away from the mirror. And we have Y on the bottom, furthest away from the mirror. If we have a carbon with 4 different types of bonds around it, like in this example, just like your right and left hand, you won't be able to actually take these 2 molecules and make them the same. They won't line up completely. They'll be mirror images of each other. And it turns out that since carbon is the basis of organic molecules, and since proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, DNA, the molecules that we find in living things are organic, you have lots and lots and lots of chiral molecules in you. But in most instances, you only have one type of chiral molecule. Sometimes you have both. But if we look at your body, one of the things that we find in your body is proteins. And proteins are made from smaller molecules called amino acids. And all the amino acids that are found in nature have the L configuration. L and D are the two designations for kind of the right and left hand. The only exception to this is there's a few weird D amino acids in the cell walls of some bacteria. There are a lot of pharmaceutical drugs. Ibuprofen is one example, where one of the enantiomers, and an enantiomer is either the right-handed molecule or the left-handed molecule. There are a lot of pharmaceutical drugs where one enantiomer is pharmacologically active. In this case, there's one version of ibuprofen that can help get rid of your pain. The other enantiomer doesn't do anything. Now, in some cases, one enantiomer is useful and the other one, as I mentioned, is actually harmful. It's a type of poison. And we're not going to figure this out, but you will hear me mention on several occasions that, amino acids tend to be left-handed. Carbohydrates tend to be right-handed. And it might seem like I'm being real picky and it doesn't matter, but go back to something I said a few moments ago. Even though they're really small, at a molecular level, molecules work according to their three-dimensional shape. And if you think it doesn't matter right-handed versus left-handed, try to shake hands with somebody with them using their right hand and you using your left hand. It doesn't really fit together. So when we have molecules and all the molecules around are right-handed, a left-handed molecule doesn't really fit in. This turns out to be important. A few years ago, there were a number of weightlifters and they were taking some amino acid supplement, and the supplement was made in a lab. And when you make a supplement in a lab, usually you get equal amounts of the right-handed version of the molecule and the left-handed version of the molecule. Well, they took this amino supplement and 3 or 4 of them died. Why did they die? Because your body can't tolerate right-handed amino acids. So they were pretty lucky that actually only a few people died before they figured out what it was and got it off the market. So a lot of reasons why carbon is important. Makes a lot of bonds, can make single, double, or triple bonds. It can make polar or nonpolar covalent bonds. It can form straight chains, branch chains, rings. It can make chiral molecules, enantiomers. It can make isomers. So remember what I said when we started our discussion. There's as many carbon molecules as there are molecules of everything else put together. And because of its properties, this is one of the reasons why. So carbon is crucial. Now, something I've already said a few times, and again, something you'll get tired of hearing over the course of the semester. The organic molecules that are found in living things are usually large. If we look at the average protein in the human body, the average protein in the human body is over 100 amino acids long. And if we look at an amino acid is at least 10 atoms. So 100 amino acids, 10 atoms each. There are at least 1,000 atoms in an average protein. And sometimes there are millions. So when we look at a protein or any large molecule, the protein isn't the same everywhere. It's got different properties in different areas. And the properties are determined by some things that we call functional groups. Now, a functional group is a little cluster of atoms. And it's a cluster of atoms that gives the part of the molecule where it's located. It gives that part of the molecule its chemical properties. Now, we're mostly interested in one of those chemical properties. The main thing that we're interested in is whether it makes that part of the molecule polar or nonpolar or ionic. Because when we look at areas of a molecule that are polar or ionic, they tend to mix pretty well with water. They tend to dissolve in water. If we look at parts of a molecule that are nonpolar, they don't mix so well with water. So since molecules are three-dimensional things, and since the main molecule we find in your body is water, what we see is that most molecules in the body are kind of like big blobs. And on the inside of this blob, this is where the nonpolar bonds are found. On the outside of the blob, the part that's going to come into contact with the water, this is where the polar and ionic bonds are found. So let's look at some of the basic functional groups. Keep in mind that, like a lot of other things we do, this is really just an introduction to functional groups. If you decide you want to go to medical school or pharmacy school or dental school, you'll have to take organic chemistry. And in organic chemistry, you'll discover that there are about 40 functional groups. So we're going to focus on just a few that are common. So one is called the hydroxyl group. And notice the hydroxyl group is written as ROH. The lines represent chemical bonds, similar to before. R in chemistry actually stands for something called residue. And residue is basically what would be left of this molecule if you took off the functional group. I think it's sometimes easier to think of it as meaning the rest of the molecule. So if we have something and it has OH on it, the R is everything except that OH. Now notice oxygen and hydrogen. When we look at them, oxygen and hydrogen are different elements. And if we have different elements, except for that one exception, carbon and hydrogen, we have different elements that are bonded together. That's going to make a polar bond. So this is going to make the part of the molecule where it's found polar. If we have a methyl group is R, which is, again, the rest of the molecule. And then it's a carbon, and this is CH3, but that really means this carbon has 3 single bonds to 3 carbon atoms. Well, remember the bond between carbon and hydrogen is nonpolar. Yeah. So this is going to make this part of the molecule nonpolar. So if we have a part of the molecule where we just see carbon and hydrogen, it's not going to mix with water very well. We have something called the carbonyl group, or it's sometimes called the carbonyl group. And in the carbonyl group, we have a carbon, and it has a double bond to an oxygen. And a bond between carbon and oxygen, this is a bond between 2 different atoms. So this is a polar bond. And then since carbon has 4 bonds, it has 2 other bonds. So it can have 2 other R groups attached to it. Now we'll see some examples of R groups in a minute, so that'll be a little bit less abstract. Now for the fourth one, we want to think about its name for a moment. So this is something called a carboxyl group. And a carboxyl group has a double bonded oxygen. Well, notice we just had a double bonded oxygen up in this carbonyl group, and it has an OH. And if we go back to our first functional group, the hydroxyl group, we had an OH there. So notice if we look at the name, carbonyl starts out the same way as carboxyl does. So carboxyl starts like carbonyl, and it has a double bonded oxygen. It ends like hydroxyl does, and it has an OH group. Now, what's the difference? Why does it have a different name? Well, notice in this case, we could have something where we had a hydroxyl group on a carbon, and that carbon could be right next to a carbon that had a carbonyl group. In a carboxyl group, the double bonded oxygen and the OH are bonded to the same carbon. And when they're bonded to the same carbon, they actually have different chemical properties. So that's why we give them the carboxyl group. Now notice if we put this in water, and since living cells are mostly water, they usually are in water, at least in the circumstances we'll be thinking about, this carboxyl group loses this hydrogen. And when it loses that hydrogen, that forms an acid ion. So we'll look at that a little bit later. There's also something called the amino group. Now, nitrogen makes 3 bonds. So an amino group is a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens, and then the third bond is to R. Notice we've always got an R in here. And in water, nitrogen can pick up another hydrogen and have a positive charge. And the amino group is basic. So later we'll talk about acids and bases. But here are some examples of some functional groups that are going to make organic molecules acidic or basic. Now, the phosphate group is a phosphorus atom with 4 oxygens attached. And then one of the oxygens is attached by a double bond. 2 of the oxygens can have OHs, and the 4th oxygen is connected back to the R, to the rest of the molecule. When we look at this, this phosphorus, the oxygens with the H's, can lose their H's. And as a result, when we have something that can lose H's, this is considered to be acidic. So this is very similar in that sense to the carboxyl group that we had up here. And notice they're both losing H's from OH. And then finally, the last functional group we're going to talk about a little bit is the sulfhydryl group. And this is R connected to a sulfur atom, connected to a hydrogen. And I'm going to go back up to the top. Notice that this is very similar to R connected to an oxygen atom, to a hydrogen. And the sulfhydryl group actually has some common properties with the hydroxyl group. Now notice, except for the methyl group, we have 3 groups that are polar here: the hydroxyl group, the carbonyl group, and the sulfhydryl group. And we have 3 groups that are ionic when we put them in water. So remember what we said, functional groups that are ionic are polar, are going to allow that part of the molecule where they're found to mix with water. So these areas of molecules are going to mix with water. So let's go through and look at all these functional groups in a little more detail. So let's look
What
first.
does ionic mean again?
I'm sorry, what, Andre?
What does ionic mean again?
It has a positive or negative charge, so it's either lost an electron or gained an electron.
Okay. Do you know when the next test is going to be?
We'll probably finish with chemistry next Tuesday or Wednesday. So we'll probably wait to have the test till the Monday after that so that you have a weekend to get prepared.
Okay.
Unless everybody tells me they really want to have it Thursday. So let's look at some examples of compounds that have the methyl group. And one example, the simplest example of something with a methyl group, let's go back up to our chart for a minute. Remember, the methyl group is a carbon with 3 hydrogens attached, and then we have the rest of the molecule. So here's a carbon with 3 hydrogens attached. Now notice in this case, the rest of the molecule is just another hydrogen atom. So this is a compound called methane. And if we really wanted to emphasize that this was a methyl group and it had an R group of hydrogen, we might write this as HCH3 or something like that. But usually we would just write this, as CH4. And methane is one of the chemicals that's found in natural gas. Usually when we have a lot of nonpolar bonds, chemicals with a lot of nonpolar bonds tend to have a lot of energy in their bonds. Remember, we said there's energy stored in chemical bonds. So there's a lot of energy and a lot of the compounds that just have carbon and hydrogen. Because remember, carbon to carbon bonds are nonpolar, carbon to hydrogen bonds are nonpolar. So a lot of compounds that just have carbon and hydrogen are used as fuels. They're the main types of things that we find in petroleum, which we use to make gasoline. They're found in natural gas, they're found in coal, all sorts of things that we use as fuels. So another example of something with the methyl group is ethane. So notice if we look at ethane, if we think again about this CH3, a carbon with 3 hydrogens on the left, here's our methyl group. What's the R group? Another methyl group. So in the methyl group, a carbon has 3 bonds to hydrogen, but carbon needs 4. So if we have 2 methyl groups, we can put them together by making a bond between their carbon atoms so that each of their carbons get a 4th bond. Another example of something that's in this general category is something that, again, you might have heard of called propane, which is also a component of natural gas. So if we look at propane, we have 3 carbons. The first one is CH3, so here's our methyl group. What's the R group? Well, everything to the right of that, CH2 connected to CH3. Or notice if we were writing this, you might write CH2 because this carbon has 2 hydrogens on it, CH3, but you could also combine them and say, instead of saying CH2, CH3, you could say C2, 2 carbons, H5, and add up all the hydrogens. Now, what's the example of writing, what's the advantage of writing CH2, CH3? Well, it gives us a little bit more of a clue about how the atoms are connected. So if we look at something like ethane, and we were writing the whole formula for ethane, we could just count the atoms. We could say ethane has 3 carbons. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hydrogens. So the formula for ethane is C3H8. But that doesn't give us much of a hint how the atoms are connected. So sometimes it's better if we're trying to visualize the molecule to say that the formula for propane is CH3, CH2, CH3. And notice if we decide to write the formula that way, we just kind of go down the line. We write the first carbon, and then behind it, we write whatever is attached to it, CH3. Then we write the next carbon, and whatever is attached to it, CH2. Then we write the next carbon, and whatever is bonded to it, CH3 again. And we would keep going if we had more. Now, notice we saw an example of this a few minutes before we started talking about functional groups. If you go back here, the butane and the isobutane that we looked at are molecules that have a methyl group. So here's a methyl group on the left end and on the right end. Actually, in isobutane, notice there are 3 methyl groups. So when we look at the methyl group, it's commonly found in things that are used as fuels. Another type of molecule that has the methyl group that you've heard of is something called octane. Where do you see octane? Does anybody know? When you go to a gas station, if you look on the gas pump, there's a rating, not the price, but there's a rating for the type of gas, 89, 91, something like that. That's its octane rating. Because if you go way back, probably about 120 years ago now, when automobiles were just starting to come into widespread use, it was believed that 100% octane was the most efficient fuel. So if you go to the gas pump and you fill up your car and the gas pump says 89 for its octane rating, it's 89% as efficient as pure octane would be. Now, keep in mind, this rating system was actually devised about 100 years ago or so. So there are actually some fuels that have octane ratings higher than 100. Because it turns out octane is not the most efficient fuel. We thought it was back then. And the rating system got kept, even though there are some fuels that are more efficient. Now, if you think about octane, and notice if we just have carbon and hydrogen, one of the clues in the name is the name always ends in ane: methane, ethane, propane, butane, octane. How many carbon atoms do you think are in octane? Does anybody know? Does anybody know how many arms an octopus has, or how many sides are on an octagon?
8.
8. So octane has 8 carbon atoms. So we won't learn all the details, but notice that some of the names that we'll look at will seem very complicated, but the names actually give us, once you learn the technique for naming them, the names actually tell us, how many carbon atoms, what type of functional groups are in it, where those functional groups are located. So if you read the book, or if you're looking up something online or in our notes, don't get psyched out if you see a really long name. We're not going to worry about trying to figure out how you name things. That's a subject for organic chemistry if you go on and take that class. But realize that it can be useful because it actually tells us exactly how the atoms in those molecules are bonded together. So we said all the other functional groups are polar or ionic, and polar and ionic things make the part of the molecule where they're found hydrophilic. They make it mix with water. Notice if we have something where we just have a methane group, or just carbon and hydrogen in general, that part of the molecule will be hydrophobic. It won't mix with water very well. And a good example of this is, if you've ever seen on a parking lot after it rains, maybe a little oil slick where somebody spilled some oil or gasoline, and it floats on top of the water, because nonpolar things and polar things don't generally mix very well. We'll talk about 1 or 2 exceptions later, but they really are exceptions. So the first functional group that is polar that we'll talk about is the hydroxyl group. And the hydroxyl group is often designated as a dash with an OH. Now, oxygen needs 2 bonds. Hydrogen needs 1. So there's a bond between the oxygen and hydrogen here, and the dash indicates that this oxygen has another bond. In our diagram up above, our little chart, that dash was the line that was going down to the R, to the rest of the molecule. So sometimes the R is written there, sometimes the hydroxyl group, is just shown with that dash. Now, compounds that have this functional group are sometimes called alcohols, or if they're really big, we don't necessarily put alcohol in their name, but sometimes they will end in OL. So the simplest type of molecule that has an OH functional group is something called methanol. And methanol has the formula CH3OH. So notice that CH3 is a methyl group. So if you imagine coming up to methane and taking off one hydrogen and replacing it with an OH, that's all we have here. So when we think about methanol, methanol is sometimes called wood alcohol. Notice it's also sometimes called methyl alcohol. Now, methanol is why it's illegal to make alcohol at home in a still and then to sell that alcohol, because methanol is deadly poisonous. Regular drinking alcohol can kill you, but just a little bit of methanol will kill you. And methanol gets made if you're making alcohol, if you have your homemade still in your garage or your basement, or if you live out in the backwoods, and this is on the back 40 if you're a moonshiner, I think they're called. If you have wooden parts in your still, the wooden parts, when you make the alcohol, will make wood alcohol. So if you've ever seen or read anything about, these moonshiners who live out in the woods and make alcohol, what do they use to make their alcohol in? They use old bathtubs or old furnaces or something like that. And it might seem like, why would you do that? Because you need to have a container that doesn't have, excuse me, that doesn't have any wood in it. Now, ethanol has the formula C2H5OH, or it's sometimes written as CH2OH, CH3. So notice if we look at ethane, and you might guess ethanol says CH2OH. So we're going to take one of these hydrogens off our first carbon, and we're going to replace it with an OH. Now notice if we do that, it doesn't really matter if we take the top hydrogen or the middle or the bottom one, because actually the molecules can kind of twist and rotate around these bonds. So if you put the OH up here on top of the first carbon or down here or on the very bottom, it's really equivalent in a chemical sense. Now notice with both methanol and ethanol, let's look at methanol first. If you think about the formula for methanol, CH3OH, well, that's not the easiest way to write that formula. Notice there's CH3, but there's another H here. So you could write methanol as CH4O. The disadvantage to writing the formula for methanol as CH4O is it doesn't give you much of a clue how the atoms are connected. With hydrogen atoms, when we write a formula out, I guess I would call it the long way, whatever the hydrogen is written behind, that's what it's bonded to. So the same thing applies here when we look at ethanol. We could write ethanol as C2H6. We're going to add this last hydrogen in, O. But it's much more informative to write the formula for ethanol, as CH2OH, CH3. So here's methanol, CH3OH. Here's ethanol, CH2OH, CH3. So when we write the formula, we like to try to give ourselves a hint about how the atoms are connected. If you wrote the formula for ethanol and you wrote C2H6O, that would be correct. If I go around and I count the atoms and you wrote C2, yep, there's 2 hydrogens. H6, yep, there's 6 hydrogens, 2 carbons, 1 oxygen. So that would be correct, but we want to give ourselves a hint about how the atoms are connected. because sometimes there's more than one way they could be connected. For instance, if we just write C2H6O, there's actually 2 molecules that have that formula. So we wouldn't know for sure if we were talking about ethanol. Now, again, if you think about what R is everything past the OH group. So in methanol, the R group is CH3. In ethanol, the R group is CH2, CH3, or C2H5 if you prefer. You could add them both up. Now, notice ethanol is called grain alcohol, and grain alcohol can kill you, but it's not as poisonous. So grain alcohol, ethanol, is the type of alcohol that people have been known to drink. And notice if you're drinking alcohol, it doesn't really matter whether you're drinking beer or wine or some type of hard liquor like whiskey. The alcohol in all of them is ethanol. The difference between beer and wine and whiskey or some other hard liquor, the difference is what is the percentage of alcohol, and not just what's the percent. But usually the way we make alcohol is we take yeast and we feed them a carbohydrate and we put them in an environment without oxygen. So for instance, there's a Japanese alcohol called sake, and sake is made by giving yeast rice. If we look at wine, wine is made by giving the yeast grapes. So we give them a source of carbohydrate, we put them in an environment without oxygen. Now, notice when the yeast actually produce about 20% alcohol, it kills them. But if you look at hard liquor like whiskey, whiskey is at least, I think by law, it has to be at least 80% alcohol. So how do you get 80% alcohol if the yeast die after they make 20%? Because when the yeast die, you know, they're in a vat and the vat is 20% alcohol, 80% water. So we have to do something called distill the alcohol. And when we distill the alcohol, basically what we do is we boil it. Alcohol has a very low boiling point. So if we have a vat and we're trying to make it into whiskey, we've got 20% alcohol, we've got 80% water. We start heating it and the alcohol will boil off first and the water gets left behind. So then what we do is we collect the alcohol, purify it, and we have something that has a higher alcohol content. Why? Because we left most of the water behind. So when we distill something, we usually separate the thing that will boil first. And when we're making alcohol, it's the alcohol that boils first before the water. Another type of alcohol that's relatively common is something called isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol. And if we look at this isopropyl alcohol, so here's one of those ball and stick models. Remember we said oxygen, since it burns things, is usually shown as red. Carbon atoms are black, hydrogen are white. If we look at isopropyl alcohol, it has the formula CH3. So there's our first carbon, CH3, CHOH, and then CH3 again. Or you could write it as C3H7OH. Or if you really wanted to save space, you could write it as C3H8O. But again, there's actually more than one molecule that has the formula C3H8O. So that wouldn't really be quite enough information to know that it was rubbing alcohol. Now, when we look at some really big molecules, their name tells us that they've got the alcohol functional group, the hydroxyl functional group in them. So think about a molecule that you've all heard of called cholesterol. So notice this is one of those models where it's just showing us the bonds between carbon atoms. So every place you see a number, there is a carbon atom. So this is the chemical formula for cholesterol. So if we would look, let's look over here on the far end, 27, there's a carbon atom. Well, remember, carbon atoms have to have 4 bonds. So wherever we see a number sticking out at 27, 26, 21, 18, 19, every one of those lines sticking out represents a CH3 group, so that those carbons have 4 bonds. For the other carbons that are somewhere in the middle, it depends how many bonds they have to other carbons. So let's look at number 15 for a second. Number 15, there's a carbon atom located there. It has a bond to the carbon atom at 14. We can see the line going across. It has a bond to the carbon atom located at 16. So that's 2 bonds. So the carbon atom at number 15 would have 2 hydrogen atoms bonded to it. Now let's look at the carbon atom at number 6. The carbon atom at number 6, notice there's not 1 line going to number 5, there's 2. This is a double bond. So the carbon atom at 6 has a double bond to the carbon atom at 5. It has a single bond to the carbon atom at 7. So that's a total of 3 bonds. Carbon needs 4 bonds. So the carbon atom at number 6 must have a hydrogen attached to it. And kind of like the rules for naming the molecules that I talked about a moment ago, there's actually a very complex set of rules for numbering the carbon atoms in an organic molecule. We're not going to worry about that, but I did want to show you an example. And the reason that it matters is, you know, we mostly hear about cholesterol being bad. If your cholesterol levels are high, you could get heart disease. But actually you need cholesterol in your body. And one of the things you do with the cholesterol in your body is you use it to make lots of other molecules. Now, when you make those other molecules, you might add an OH group, a hydroxyl group, or you might add a carbonyl group, a double bonded oxygen. But it makes a difference when you add an OH group. Do you add it at number 12 or number 17 or number 6? Where exactly does it fit in? So these rules allow us to, when we name the molecule, if we have an extra OH group on here, it makes it very simple to specify exactly where that second OH is located. Now, here's an example of another molecule that's made from this. Notice that here we've taken off our numbers. And here, if we look, I don't think I can get these both in view at the same time. But notice up here notice this would be an example of a carbons forming a ring or a cyclic molecule. There's a CH3 group coming up here at number 19. That CH3 group is gone here. And if we look up here where this OH is, notice that there was a big branch chain of carbons here, number 20, 21, 22, all the way to 27. And here we just have an OH group. So we have a couple of modifications. There's no CH3 here. We're missing a big chain of carbon and hydrogen here. And in its place, we have an OH. This is a molecule called estradiol. Di means 2. So this has 2 hydroxyl groups. And this is actually the chemical name for estrogen. And your body makes estrogen from cholesterol. So if a woman doesn't have enough cholesterol in her diet, she doesn't make enough estrogen, as well as some other chemicals. It would be similar in a man, except in males, it's testosterone that would be crucial. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, here's that sulfhydryl group that's very similar to hydroxyl, except instead of being OH, it's SH. And this sulfhydryl group, the main place that we'll see it this semester is in an amino acid called cysteine. Now, there are 20 amino acids that are commonly found in proteins. So remember, I've said a little while ago that the average protein in the human body is more than 100 amino acids long. So think of amino acids like letters, and proteins are like words. There's 26 letters in the English alphabet, and then you make a word by either using the same letters in a different order or by using different letters. The way that your body makes different proteins is it either uses the same amino acids, but in a different order, or different amino acids. And cysteine is very important in the amino acids because it contains this sulfhydryl group. And this is important because if we have cysteines at a couple of spots in a protein, or sometimes they can even be on proteins that are just next to each other. So this kind of purplish line here, it's labeled polypeptide backbone. You know, if you're taking notes on the notes I posted, this is the chain of amino acids that makes up a protein. We'll talk later, but it's also called a polypeptide. If we have a couple of spots where we have cysteines, notice that coming off a carbon here in cysteine, we have a CH2 and then an SH. So here's a CH2 and an S, here's a CH2 and another S. Sometimes these cysteines lose their hydrogens. And then to make up for that missing bond to hydrogen, whenever something loses a bond, it's got to replace it. Whenever that happens here, this cysteine can bond to another cysteine, and that makes a disulfide bridge. Now, this can be very important because remember, we've said, even though molecules are very small, they work according to their three-dimensional shape. And where we have a disulfide bridge, we tie two sections of a molecule together, or sometimes we attach one molecule to another. So we affect their shape. So one example of how much this affects the shape is if you've ever gotten something called a perm. When you get a perm, what they do is they put a chemical on your hair, and the chemical breaks these disulfide bridges. And then they put a different chemical on your hair, and the different chemical on your hair, keep in mind, there's some of these cysteine amino acids. They're at a bunch of different spots. So they break the disulfide bridges that are already in your hair, and then they put another chemical and they reattach them at a different spot. So if your hair is straight, they can make it curly or wavy. And if your hair is curly or wavy, they can make it straight. It all depends on which chemicals they use and how they reattach those disulfide bridges. So that's not real important biologically, but it's a good example of how they do affect the shape of molecules. Because in this case, when we change how those keratin molecules are connected to each other, we change the appearance of your hair. So now let's look at another functional group with oxygen, that carbonyl group or carbonyl group. I've heard it pronounced both ways. So whichever way you say it, I won't yell at you. This is a carbon with a double bonded oxygen. And molecules that contain this functional group are either called aldehydes or ketones. Or again, if they're pretty big, we might not write out the whole thing. They might just end in Al or in ONE. So here's the simplest molecule that is an aldehyde. It's something you might have heard of called formaldehyde. Formaldehyde is used as a preservative. We're kind of getting rid of it, but formaldehyde used to be used in a lot of clothing that was called permanent press or no iron. And it was also used in wood paneling that a lot of people put in their houses. The reason we're getting rid of formaldehyde is because it's been discovered that formaldehyde over the course of the years gives off some gases that are not really healthy for you to be breathing. So if you have old paneling in the basement of your house or someplace else, you might want to check and make sure that it doesn't have formaldehyde in it. Now, the most common ketone that people have heard of is something called acetone. So again, there's always, once we get to a molecule that's more than a few atoms, there's always alternate ways to write it. So we could write this as C3H6O, or we could also write this as CH3, CO, CH3. And notice when we write the formula out this longhand way, if we go through and we add our carbon atoms, when we add our carbon atoms, there are 3 of them. When we add up our hydrogen atoms, there are 6 of them. When we check our oxygens, there's just 1. So really, when we add these up, they should add up to the same thing that we see here, or they should add up to the same thing that we see in our Kekule structure, because these are just 3 different ways of representing the same molecule. Kind of like if you imagine we could take a picture of you, we could have somebody paint a painting of you, we could have somebody draw you with crayons, we could have somebody draw you with chalk, but they're all you, so ultimately they should all be equivalent to each other. Now, when we look at ketones, the oxygen atom that has a double bond to a carbon is somewhere in the middle of the carbon chain. So notice in acetone, it's on the 2nd carbon. If the double bonded oxygen was on the 1st carbon or the 3rd, it wouldn't be a ketone, it would be an aldehyde. In aldehydes, the double bonded oxygen is on one of the end carbons in the chain. So it's never in the very middle. And notice it doesn't have to be the exact middle. If we had, 25 carbons in our chain, this double bonded oxygen could be on the 7th carbon. It would still be a ketone. And again, like we saw before, there are some large molecules that end in ONE that you might have heard of, things like testosterone, cortisone, progesterone. They all end in ONE. They all have this carbonyl functional group. Now, notice if we look at this, we can see this basic shape of 4 rings with something oxygen down here. Notice that that looks very similar to what we saw for estradiol or for cholesterol. We've got those 4 rings with the oxygen down here. We'll talk about this group of chemicals later, but something that I'm sure you've all heard of is chemicals that are called steroids. Steroids are molecules that have this basic shape. Now notice in this particular Kekule model, there are some of the bonds that look a little bit different. There are some of the bonds that are represented by kind of dashed lines, and there are some of the bonds that are represented by lines that are thicker at one end than the other. They're often called wedges. And to think about what these represent, we have to go back to something I've already mentioned a couple of times. Even though they're very small, molecules are 3-dimensional. So if we imagine taking this molecule, this is a molecule of testosterone, by the way. If we imagine taking this molecule and laying it flat on your computer screen, the dotted lines represent bonds that go back into the computer. The bonds with wedges represent bonds that come out of the computer towards you. So this is a way to try to show the 3-dimensional shape of the molecule a little bit better. And again, we'll see this in a couple of diagrams. Most of the time, we won't see this. If we didn't have these wedges and dotted lines, Notice we wouldn't have any of these three bonds being shown, because remember, when we show the bonds this way, we're only showing the bonds that aren't bonds to a hydrogen. So if we have a bond between carbon and hydrogen, we wouldn't show it. So these three lines wouldn't be here. And these two wedges coming up would just be a straight line coming up. And this would be just an angled line. It wouldn't be a wedge. So notice as we go along, it's becoming obvious there are a million different ways to represent molecules. Why so many different ways? Well, exactly how we draw them depends on what we're trying to emphasize. In some cases, one way to draw them is more appropriate than another. Now, the next group of molecules we want to talk about is organic acids. And organic acids have the carboxyl group, COOH. Now, remember, this is the one that I said, if you think about the name, it starts out like carbonyl and it ends up like hydroxyl. And remember that a carbonyl is a carbon attached to a double bonded oxygen, and a hydroxyl is an OH. So notice the name also gives you a hint, but so does the way that we write the functional group. The key thing is here, they have to be on the same carbon atom. If they're just on carbon atoms next to each other, then we have a hydroxyl group and a carbonyl group. They have to be on the exact same carbon. Some big molecules, you could have a carboxyl group, and then someplace else you might have a carbonyl group, and someplace else you might have a hydroxyl. But if they're on the same carbon atom, then they get a different name. Since this is the carboxyl group, sometimes these molecules are called organic acids. Sometimes they're called carboxylic acids. Some examples of this that you're probably familiar with are acetic acid, which is found in vinegar. Or if you have apple cider and it sits too long, it starts to turn to vinegar. Acetic acid is actually what gives vinegar that distinctive smell. Now, there's something that's kind of related to this. You can tell by the beginning of the name, acetyl, but it's got a longer name, acetyl salicylic acid. This is actually the ingredient that fights pain that's found in aspirin. When it says that your aspirin tablet that you're taking is 120 milligrams or whatever it is, it's 120 milligrams of acetyl salicylic acid. There's typically a lot of other things in there. There's something to make the aspirin taste better, because acetyl salicylic acid actually has a pretty bitter taste. If you've ever ended up not swallowing an aspirin, but kind of chewing it up, they usually don't taste very good. So this is acetyl salicylic acid down here. So notice we have a ring of carbon atoms in here. There are double bonds between some of the carbons. Here, if we look at this carbon, remember at every kind of tip, there's a carbon in this representation. So there's a carbon here. It has a double bond to an oxygen and an OH. So this is our carboxyl group. Over here, we have a carbon and it has a double bond to an oxygen. But notice the same carbon doesn't have an OH. So this is just a carbonyl group here. This is a carboxyl group over here. Now notice this carbon is connected to an oxygen, but not to an OH, just to an oxygen. And the second bond of this oxygen is to one of the carbons in the ring. So if there was a hydrogen here, if that's where the second bond of the oxygen was going instead of here, then this would be a carboxyl group. And then notice you can see there's a methyl group down here. So this is acetyl salicylic acid. This is something called palmitic acid. Now remember what we said, when we have a straight chain of carbon, It's not really straight, but it's definitely easier to look at. If we look at this and we count, we've got our COOH. So notice here's our carboxyl group. And then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. We've got 14 carbons in a row that are CH2. And then we've got CH3. So this is something called palmitic acid. And one of the main places that palmitic acid is found is in shampoo. There's also another acid called lauric acid that's in shampoo. And either tomorrow or next week, we'll look at kind of how shampoo works, what's the idea behind it, cleaning your hair. But notice that when we look at this, if you think about this molecule in terms of what we've been discussing, at this end of the molecule, we have a carbon with a double bond to an O and an OH. So this part of the molecule is polar. And then we have a big long section that just has carbon and hydrogen. Well, remember what we've said, carbon to carbon bonds are nonpolar, carbon to hydrogen bonds are nonpolar. So if we look at this molecule, this is a good example of something we've been talking about. It doesn't have the same properties everywhere. Over here on the left end, there's a very small section that's polar. Then on the right, there's a really big section that's nonpolar. So, according to what we know, we would expect this nonpolar section where we just have these carbons and hydrogens. We would expect that section to not mix very well with water. The COOH, since that's polar, and in fact, it's actually ionic because usually we lose this hydrogen when we put it in water, we would expect this to mix with water. So kind of makes sense that shampoo should have at least some section that mixes with water. Now, if we have an organic acid and it loses this hydrogen that's attached to the OH, usually when this hydrogen leaves the molecule, it doesn't take its electron with it. So when the hydrogen leaves, it has a positive charge because the hydrogen has a proton, but it left its electron behind. And we have a negative charge centered around this oxygen. So here's another type of acid that's found in the human body called lactic acid. So we have a central carbon, it's got a bond to a hydrogen atom, it's got an OH, it's got a hydroxyl group attached to it, it's got a CH3, it's got a methyl group, and then it's got a COOH, our carboxyl group. So sometimes what happens is this oxygen with the OH loses the hydrogen. So notice this is shown as O with a minus charge, because when the oxygen loses that hydrogen, remember the oxygen is sharing electrons with the hydrogen. The oxygen is stronger, it keeps that electron. So this oxygen has a negative charge because it has an extra electron, the one it stole from that hydrogen. And this hydrogen lost its electron. So hydrogen atoms have one proton and one electron, but since this lost its electron, it has one proton and it has 0 electrons. So this hydrogen has a positive charge. And one of the ways that we think about acids when we think about chemistry is acids make hydrogen ions with positive charges. Now, notice that if we look at the arrow for this equation, the arrow is a little bit different than what we normally see. Remember when we first started discussing chemical reactions that occur in metabolism, metabolic reactions? One of the things I said was that a lot of metabolic reactions can reverse. The thing that we think of as the reactants can make the products, but under the right conditions, the products can make the reactants. So notice here we have half of the arrow going from the reactant, lactic acid, to the product, lactate. But another half of the arrow is going from the product, lactate, back to the reactant, lactic acid. So this is a reversible equation or reaction. Now, notice that when we lose our hydrogen ion off the OH, we don't call this lactic acid anymore. We call it lactate. So, you know, if we would go back and look at some of our earlier names, when the carboxyl group in acetic acid loses its hydrogen, it's now called acetate. When the carboxyl group in acetyl salicylic acid loses its carboxyl group, it's acetyl salicylate. When the carboxyl group in citric acid loses its hydrogen, it's citrate. So when we see that ATE ending, not always, but a lot of times that's a hint that what we're looking at is something that started out as an organic acid and it lost its hydrogen. Okay, 2 more functional groups to go. So let's look at the amino functional group. So notice we had 3 functional groups involving oxygen: hydroxyl, carbonyl, and then the carboxyl, which was kind of a combination of those 2. So the amino functional group is NH2. Notice we see that dash again. Nitrogen atoms normally need to make 3 bonds. So that dash indicates, if we go way up to our chart again, that dash indicates that this nitrogen is going to have another bond going back to that R, to the residue, the remainder of the molecule. So when we look at this NH2, we find it in many different places. One of the places that we mentioned before is this NH2 is found in urea, which is a waste product. One of the main types of waste that you have to get rid of in your body is nitrogen. So if we look at urea, urea is something that's found in your blood and then it's filtered out of your blood and is eliminated from your body in the urine. So if we look at this, notice on the left end, we have a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. Okay, that's the amino group. On the right end, we have a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. That's another amino group. That's one of the reasons that this is a good way to eliminate nitrogen. It's kind of a small molecule, but we get rid of 2 nitrogen atoms. And in the middle, notice whenever we don't indicate that we have something like nitrogen at the tip of a bond, it's carbon. So in the middle, we have a carbon with a double bonded O. We have that carbonyl group. So this is urea. If we look at the things that are called nucleotides, the building blocks of DNA and RNA, adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine, and something called uracil. Notice that INE ending. These molecules all contain either a nitrogen with 1 hydrogen, not hydrogens, or a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. Well, when we have 2 hydrogens, that's this amino group we've been talking about. If we just have 1 hydrogen attached to the nitrogen, it's usually called the amine group instead of the amino group. And so these have the same types of functional groups. The amine functional group and the amino functional group are almost the same. The amino has 1 extra hydrogen. In fact, sometimes the amino functional group is considered to be a subcategory of the amine functional group. Okay, finally, the last functional group that we're going to talk about is the phosphate group. And the phosphate group is H2PO4 with a negative charge, or HPO4 with 2 negative charges. So when we look at this, so here's a molecule called ATP, and ATP is short for adenosine triphosphate. So the adenine is one of the molecules that we mentioned with DNA that has the amine and the amino functional groups. So here's adenine. The part of the molecule that's indicated in blue is something called ribose. And if we think about things that end in OSE, they're almost always carbohydrates. Think of glucose. We talked about that very briefly. And then here, triphosphate, tri like a tricycle means 3. We have 3 phosphate groups. We can see 3 phosphorus atoms as we go along here. So when we look at this, phosphate groups are also found in a molecule that we're going to talk quite a bit about called a phospholipid. And a phospholipid, lipids are the things that we sometimes call fats in everyday language. As we'll see when we talk about lipids, that's not really a good way to refer them. Fats are one particular type of lipid. So these 2 brown areas are areas that are usually called nonpolar fatty acid tails. So fatty acids, that's another fancy name for palmitic acid and things like that. So this fatty acid tail, notice it's showing that zigzag up and down pattern of the carbon atoms. So we have 2 of those. They can be either saturated fatty acids or unsaturated. And the saturated fatty acids have a straighter shape. The unsaturated fatty acids tend to be bent. We'll talk about that tomorrow or Monday. And notice here we have a phosphorus atom with 4 oxygens. So here's our phosphate group. And the phosphate group is part of what's called the polar head. Because remember, when we have a bond between atoms of different elements, that bond is usually a polar bond. So in a phosphate group, excuse me, we have several bonds between a phosphorus atom and oxygen atoms. So this part of the molecule is polar, this part is nonpolar. So similar to what we talked about a moment ago with palmitic acid, this part of the molecule shown in purple that's polar would mix with water fairly easily. These sections of the molecule that are shown in brown are nonpolar. They don't mix with water very easily. Notice that the nonpolar part is much longer than the polar part is. We'll come back to this when we talk about phospholipids, but this is a good illustration of that. Are there any questions about the functional groups that we've talked about today before we leave for the day? If not, I'm going to stop screen sharing. And if no one has any questions, I'll let you go for the day and we'll meet again tomorrow. And tomorrow we've finally gotten to the point where we can start looking a little bit at biochemistry, the types of molecules that we find in living things. What we've talked about today, a lot of these functional groups are found in molecules that are organic molecules, but not necessarily organic molecules in living things. Some of the organic molecules with these functional groups are things that we call plastics. So enjoy the rest of the day, and I will see you tomorrow morning.